Right. So as you said, Suzanne Eggert sees John Andrews backing out of Claire's driveway around 8:30 or 9 o'clock p.m., and she heads back home. She waits for him, based on her stated timeline, about an hour to an hour and a half. It's now between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m., and John still hasn't shown up. So, Suzanne leaves her house again as she tells the court, quote, to get some cigarettes and to take a drive, end quote. She says she's tired of waiting for John to arrive. Now, Suzanne doesn't say this explicitly, but I think it's safe to assume that in reality, she's checking up on John rather than just out for a drive, as she told the court. She knows John is still interested in Claire. It's to the point of obsession, she said earlier. And his brief visit with Claire has turned into an all-day event while Suzanne sits at home waiting. It's understandable that she might develop some suspicions and want to check them out. And, sure enough, when Suzanne picks up her story, she's once again, as she says, quote, near the Shattuck Junior High School, which, of course, we know is also right across the street from Claire Andrews' house. Regardless of her reason for being in the area, Eggert says her attention gets drawn to a grassy alcove on the school property. She sees the taillights of a parked, idling vehicle aglow in the darkness. It's a warm August night in Neenah. She has her windows open, and Suzanne says she starts to hear noises coming from the courtyard.
Eggert tells the court that she hears two male voices coming from the grassy alcove at the Shattuck School. They're in an argument, she says. We don't know from the record of her testimony whether she's overhearing a heated discussion, or whether the men are shouting, or whether she can tell if they're engaged in a physical altercation during this time. But we do know that Suzanne reports that she's able to identify one of the voices. Suzanne Eggert recognizes a distinctive British accent. It's one that she knows well. Suzanne tells the court that the voice she hears echoing off the courtyard walls in the gathering darkness is that of her boyfriend, John C. Andrews. The situation is tense. The arguing continues and escalates as Suzanne listens in. She reports that the other male voice begins to plead with the individual that she's identified as Andrews. The other man, it seems, is scared of John. Suzanne hears him beg, "No, John, don't," 2 different times. The second time, Suzanne reports that the man adds, "I'll stay away from her," or possibly, "I'll stay away from Claire."
This is a pivotal moment in Suzanne Eggert's testimony. She can't see what's going on, but she is within earshot of the altercation. She recognizes the voice of John Andrews, hears the other man call him John, and learns that Claire is potentially the cause of the disagreement. Although she cannot identify the second man involved, Suzanne undoubtedly registers the edge, the desperation and the terror in his voice. She feels the tension that hangs thick in the air just out of sight in that alcove, and she shudders with the ominous sense that precedes a terrible event.
Suzanne hears a car engine revving wildly. A male scream pierces the darkness. She says it sounds cut off, as if stopped at its peak. Now metal scraping on the pavement. Suzanne states that she hears 2 loud thumps on a car and a sound like wood breaking. As the echoes fade into the night air, Suzanne hears a voice, the one that she's identified as John Andrews, saying, quote, "There, now you're dead. How do you like that?" End quote.
Eggert testifies that she drives away from the altercation down Elm Street, pulling around the corner of the school building onto Loudon Boulevard, and she parks there. It's unclear whether she sees more of the scene while she's parked there on Loudon Boulevard, or if it's while she's driving back past the school as she leaves, as there's a few conflicting reports of her testimony. But we do know Eggert states she sees John Andrews' blue Pontiac Firebird parked at the junior high in the school's driveway right near the alcove. She says she sees John leaning into the open trunk of his car. Suzanne tells the court that when she sees John standing in his car, she's hit with the realization that if she's able to see him, he can likely see her as well. She's terrified. She hurries home and she locks her door.
So that's Suzanne Eggert's testimony of the night of the murder. She doesn't see anything go down, but it's a pretty convincing story of the events and about as close as you can get without actually witnessing the murder. It's easy to see why, once Eggert finally agrees to tell the police what she knows, they feel confident in moving toward an arrest. It's very compelling testimony. All that said, we also need to point out that Suzanne Eggert is also not an ideal witness for the prosecution. First of all, we're talking about somebody who was in a relationship with John Andrews and is no longer in that relationship. Any good defense attorney can cast doubt on her motivation to provide accurate testimony against him. Based on her actions on the night of the murder, it would not be hard to paint Suzanne Eggert as an angry partner who's checking up on a philandering boyfriend by following him around the town. She saw him at Claire's, and he was there longer than she expected, all day in fact. That's a pretty good reason to be angry, right? Additionally, there's the problem of Suzanne holding details back from investigators for over a decade. Why, if she had such damning evidence of Andrews' involvement in Starkey Swenson's disappearance, did she not come forward sooner?
Yeah, those are great points. Although we have no reason to believe Suzanne Eggert's testimony is in any way inaccurate, and we certainly aren't saying that it is, it still might benefit us in our investigation of where the body could be buried to consider the source of this account. Suzanne does, however, continue her testimony, and she sheds some light on her rationale for staying silent for so long at least. On Sunday, August 14, the day after Starkey's disappearance, John Andrews visits Eggert at her home. According to Suzanne's testimony, John appears shocked when he arrives and sees the vehicle she has parked in her driveway. It's a car Suzanne has only just gotten, a used green AMC Gremlin. The night before, the night she overheard the events at the school, was the very first time Suzanne had driven that Gremlin around town. Despite her concerns, John and Suzanne go to a restaurant together. While there, Suzanne notices cuts on John's right hand and inquires how he was hurt. John states he had stopped to help two girls change a tire on their car and injured his hand while he was doing so. He also tells her that he had driven over a curb and a sidewalk as part of this, and that he had damaged his car doing that. Suzanne presses him for more information, but John becomes irritated and he makes threatening statements to her. When they get back to Eggert's home, Suzanne reports, John put his hands around her neck, pressed his thumbs into her throat, and said, quote, "What I did to him maybe I shouldn't have done, but it's too late to worry about that now." End quote. He tells her that he needs to worry about himself, that he isn't sure if he can trust her, and she says he threatens to hurt her and her children if she talks to the police. It's because of this threat and her fear of John, Suzanne tells the court, that she moves out of the state and doesn't talk to the police about what she saw and heard on the night of the murder, only finally deciding to share those details over a decade later.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, at least in helping us understand why she was hesitant to talk. She's still not a perfect witness, but remains a valuable component of the prosecution's case. Suzanne Eggert is not the only person to testify in the preliminary hearings. In fact, both Claire Andrews and Lois Swenson are called to provide testimony and shed even further light on the events of August 13, 1983.
While it was Suzanne Eggert's statement that broke the case, she's actually not the first one called to the stand in the preliminary hearing. Instead, we first hear from Claire Andrews. And what details did she provide?
Claire Andrews is able to add key information to the case, both in further explaining her relationships with Starkey Swenson and John Andrews, as well as in providing another layer of detail to the timeline from the day of the murder. Claire describes for the court a love triangle involving herself, Starkey Swenson, and John Andrews. Claire states that she met Starkey Swenson at a dance in 1974, years before she meets and ultimately marries John C. Andrews. At the time of the 1974 dance, Claire was married to another man, Robert Maskell. Starkey was married to Lois Swenson, to whom he remained married until his disappearance. Claire and Starkey began seeing each other casually at first at dances and friendly dinners, but this eventually develops into a sexual relationship. It reaches the point that they've discussed leaving their spouses to pursue a life together. Claire, in fact, does leave her then husband, Robert Maskell, but Starkey does not divorce Lois, though he continues to visit Claire's house regularly. In 1981, Claire goes on a trip to India and meets John Andrews. Tired of waiting for Starkey to leave his wife and wanting to feel some happiness, Claire pursues a relationship with Andrews. They get married in England in July 1982. The day John and Claire return to her home in Neenah, Starkey Swenson stops by to deliver a letter to Claire. He sees her luggage and apparently puts everything together, asking Claire, "You're married, aren't you?" Claire states that she hugged Swenson goodbye and spent the rest of the day crying on the couch, John with his arm around her, comforting her.
About a month goes by with the newly minted Mr. and Mrs. Andrews living out their new lives in Neenah. Claire Andrews has not seen Starkey over these weeks, but reaches out to him that August to meet up, stating she wanted to end things on better terms. They meet and they talk, but when Claire gets home, she states John is very upset. Livid is her exact word. He demands to know where she's been and makes accusations of infidelity. Over the following week, John reportedly drinks heavily, takes many pills, and puts emotional strain on he and Claire's marriage. Claire tells the court that John spends his time following her around the house and that he repeatedly shines a flashlight in her eyes during those nights to keep her from being able to sleep. At the end of the week, Claire leaves a note that she's spending the night at a friend's house after work. She does so and files for divorce the next day.
Seems pretty reasonable to me, to be honest. If somebody's following me around the house trying to prevent me from sleeping with a flashlight, I'm not sure that's a good sign of the things to come in that marriage.
Yeah, I believe there's a convention against that.
Yeah. So Claire gives us some insight into why John Andrews is furious with Starkey Swenson. He, in John's mind, has caused the end of John's marriage to Claire. She's filed for divorce after just 6 weeks of married life, and Starkey's potentially still seeing Claire throughout this time. According to Claire's testimony, she and Swenson did not maintain their sexual relationship during the 6 weeks, but John is suspicious of this. Now, this would probably be cause enough for any man to be angry at another man, but Claire says there's more to it. See, Claire continues to have a sexual relationship with John even after filing for divorce. In fact, this goes on right up to the day of Starkey's disappearance.